Morning everyone. This video lesson is analysing War Photographer by Carol Ann Duffy. In this session we're going to explore the presentation of power and conflict in War Photographer. We're going to look at a range of poetic techniques within the poem, and most importantly we're going to confidently annotate the poem. For this you're going to need a copy of War Photographer. I've shared a link to an online copy of it in the description of this video, and a pen and paper or access to a Word document. So let's start with a little bit of recall and see if we can remember the quotations that we talked about from the last video. Copy out the quotations, fill in the blanks. Pause the video, have a go at that. So what you should have got is spools of suffering, that's the rolls of film, set out in ordered rows by the photographer, like he's trying to make sense of the chaos. His hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now. So again, when he was in the heat of battle and taking his pictures, his hands were steady. He's a trained photographer, but actually now he's in the dark room developing them. His hands start shaking as all the mental trauma is coming back to him. And 100 agonies in black and white. So these pictures that he's looking at and showing with his editor are not just of pain and suffering, they're of agony, and they're in black and white. So here's the poem. Like I said, you should have your own copy with you as well. Let's have a little recap though of what we said about power and conflict in this poem. The real aim for this video is to kind of link up where exactly we can see these examples of power and conflict within the poem, because again that's what you've got to do for the actual exam here. Everything has to be through the lens of power and conflict. So in terms of power, we talked about the power of the objects, the power of memories, and how the photographer is quite powerless. With conflict, we talked about the emotional conflict and suffering that the photographer goes through. We've got the fact that the conflict, as in the war, affects him mentally. So the impact of conflict is kind of the same point there, but just expressed differently. But it's important to have those slightly differentiated, which we'll look at later on in the series of videos. And also that conflict between him and kind of what he sees as normal civilians who don't have to go through all of this suffering that he goes through. So take your time with this, have a read through the poem. Can you find any words or phrases that you might relate to the above statements about power and conflict? So it's really a chance for you to have a go at getting your teeth into the poem now with a little bit of guidance before I go through the annotations for you to have a look at as well. If you want to challenge, you can come up with your own interpretation of power or conflict. That's not an exhaustive list, that's just the kind of 3 or 6 points that I thought of. And you can select a quotation to justify your view. Pause the video, have a go at that. Right, so let's have a go at some annotation. So I've split the poem into the 4 stanzas, and the annotations are going to come up around it, and I'll talk you through it. If at any point you need to flick back or pause it, please feel free. I'm going to go through at a relatively swift pace. And also, where possible, try and, when I'm talking about a particular example or a poetic feature here, always try and, if you're going to refer to it, try and use your own words and kind of make it yours. It may be that I say something that kind of is similar to something you said. Stick with what you've got as long as you understand it. And if there's something that you absolutely don't get, and you think you disagree with, I'm not buying what I'm saying here, ignore it. It's absolutely fine. Okay, you only put down in your annotations what it is that you think is valid in this poem. So, first thing I've noticed is it's in third person. It's in his dark room. So you're looking at the photographer. You're not the photographer. It's not in first person. You're looking at him. And for me, that kind of mirrors what he's doing. He's looking at photos, having mental difficulties with it effectively. We're looking at him, and that's giving us some ideas about mental suffering that we weren't aware of before. So it's kind of mirroring what he's doing, I think. The first line, we've got the idea of him being finally alone. So again, he's been in that stressful situation with war and he's finally alone. And I think that's quite ironic in the sense that you think that should be the time when he should relax and be calm and safe, whereas actually it's the time when he's most vulnerable and most at risk. to the mental trauma and struggle that we see in the poem. We've got spools of suffering, which we've talked about. That's a metaphor. They're not really spools of suffering, they're just rolls of film. But also, they use the poet uses sibilants here. They repeat the S sound, spools of suffering. Sibilance is just a repetition of an S sound. And this happens quite a lot through the poem. And for me here, this S sounds a bit kind of aggressive, that kind of hissing, spitting, sort of frustrated sound. And I think he's almost kind of frustrated and just angry, and this is his lot. The easy bit of his job is the bit where he has to sit in his dark room staring at pictures of suffering, which is an incredibly stressful and painful thing to do. And we've already talked about the fact that they're in ordered rows, so we have to kind of make sense of the chaos, which is very difficult, trying to order them into categories to make it easier to manage, which is very, very difficult to do. The only light is red and softly glows as though this were a church and he a priest. So there's a simile here. This dark room is like a church and he is like a priest here. Now that's an interesting image. If you need to know about imagery, look back at my video from the poem London here. We do a little session on imagery there. But he's comparing himself to this priest, and I think it's a bit like a priest will deliver the service at a funeral, on like the last respects to someone who's died, and it's almost like he's doing that now. He's seeing the pictures of these people the last time they were alive, and it's like he's paying his last respects to them effectively because other people haven't done. And there's a list here, a list of places. Now these places, Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, they're famous war sites. Essentially, various important conflicts have taken place in those cities, and they're all in one word sentences. There's a full stop after each one, so you've got that pause between each one. So maybe that's the kind of symbolize the destruction, the kind of memory he's having. Up to you here. And that last phrase, all flesh is grass, which comes from the Bible, so again links to the religious tone here. Again, suggests that life is quite short and temporary. The grass grows, we cut it down. It grows again, we cut it down. A bit like human life. People grow, they get old, they die, and so on. Okay? Right. We start with a short sentence in the second stanza. He has a job to do. Again, the job's important. It kind of keeps him focused here. We've got, again, more sibilants showing the frustration of the solution slopping in trays. We've talked about the verb tremble here, and I think tremble's quite an important one because it's not like he's shaking, like sort of violently. It's just a tremble, almost like an involuntary shake, like he can't control it necessarily. And that trembling is a symbol and an example of his mental suffering here. And then we get a slight shift here. I'll go to the structure bit. There's a bit of caesura after the word now, full stop in the middle of a line. That's what caesura is, full stop in the middle of a line. And then it goes to rural England. So he talks about the suffering and the battle, then suddenly goes to rural England. And you get this list of adjectives: rural, ordinary, simple, ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel here. And there's a real conflict between like the battle site and England. In England, rural just means kind of calm and countryside essentially. And he's back to ordinary pain, which weather can dispel. So he's not worried about, people in England aren't worried about, landmines in battle sites or getting shot at. People in England moan about the weather, and they moan about, oh, it was a rough day at work today, essentially. So again, you start to get that little bit of resentment here of ordinary people's lives, and also that conflict, that contrast between a civilian's life in England and the life out on the front line in the middle of a war, even though he wasn't fighting, but still he's experienced it. And you get a lot of emotive language here. There's lots I could have picked out here. I just went for nightmare heat, but you've got running children, fields exploding beneath the feet. The idea of a nightmare, that emotive language, running children in a nightmare heat. So again, there's all that suffering and battles far away, and that normal people won't know about it. They're at home worried about the weather or moaning that Mr. Jones next door has, I don't know, mowed his lawn a bit too noisily on a Sunday morning. It's all about taking perspective here. Right, third stanza then. So first thing you might notice about this one is you get a bit more enjambment. This happens all the way through the poem, and there's examples of enjambment in every single poem, apart from one, I think, which is Charge of the Light Brigade. So if there's one technique you should learn, it's enjambment. Turns up all the time. And that's when there's no punctuation at the end of the line. So you look at the word features, cries, approval, and must. There's no punctuation, which means it kind of pushes on, essentially. The line pushes on. You have to read quickly onto the next word rather than pausing. And for me, this kind of symbolises the memories that just keep coming in and keep coming in, and he can't control them. They keep pushing and pushing, and it gets quite heavy at this point, because at this point we get a really significant memory. So at this point, the memories are flowing into his head most rapidly, and he's struggling to kind of keep a tab on it, essentially. And there's a really important metaphor of this half-formed ghost. This is a really key bit of the poem here. So a stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. So this ghost is of a person who he's photographed, and it's haunting him, which makes sense. He's seen something horrific and it's coming into his mind. Think of the enjambment here, and he can't help but thinking about this person, which makes sense in terms of the power of this image, the power of this memory. But also this person is half-formed. This ghost is half-formed. Now, I like the idea that maybe he's half-formed because maybe he's struggling to remember, maybe it's a while ago, or maybe this person got really severely injured, maybe he suffered some facial injuries or something, and actually it's like he's half-formed in that way. And it's also twisting, like a really painful verb. The features are twisting painfully in front of him here, like these memories are painful. And this bit is really heartbreaking. He remembers the cries of this man's wife. So the guy who was dead, who he's remembering now, this man's wife was crying out in pain and in suffering at her husband being killed or severely injured. And how the photographer sought approval without words, so asked permission without words, because presumably she speaks a different language to him, to do what someone must. Now, what he must do is take a picture of the dying man. What he can't do is help him. He's not medically trained, it's not his job, and his job is to photograph the tragedy and the suffering of war. And that must be the hardest thing imaginable. You've got a poor woman there who's crying because her husband's being killed or severely injured, and the photographer's just got to ask her permission to take a picture of her disfigured, dying or dead husband, and that is incredibly tough. Think of the conflict there and the emotional torment he must go through at that point. And then this the verb blood stained into the foreign dust. So again, it's like there's a permanent mark of this suffering here. This blood isn't just dripping on there, it's staining the dust. This blood and this suffering here. And there's, again, that word foreign as well. I think it's just quite a cynical phrase, that adjective foreign, in the sense that there's some people who think as long as war's happening in another country, doesn't matter. It's not on my doorstep, so I'm not going to worry about it. But actually, and I think he's feeling quite resentful that British people or people in a certain country might think, some people might think, I'm not saying everyone does, but some people might have that opinion here. They don't realise the fact that, in war-torn countries, there's a lot of really serious business going on out there, and people are suffering, innocent people are dying, and they're not paying enough attention to it. Right, last stanza. We've talked about the 100 agonies in black and white, so there's not just one or two pictures, there's hundreds of them that he's talked about. And that phrase black and white, so if I say that phrase is written down in black and white, it means it's obvious, it's basic, it's stark, it's there for you all to see. A bit like these agonies. These agonies are in black and white. Partly they're in negative form, but also they're just really obvious. It's obvious to everyone how much suffering is happening in whatever war he's taking pictures of here. And the editor will just pick out 5 or 6. Again, we discussed this previously as well. The editors don't see the level of suffering. They don't see the 100 of them. They just pick out 5 or 6 of them, the best ones, possibly I reckon the most gruesome, just to really get the readers interested and sort of sympathetic here. But the editor doesn't go through that process. They're too busy off, I don't know, having an early Friday, going for a pub lunch and playing golf or something. They don't go through the same process and the same struggle that the war photographer does. And the editor puts them in Sunday supplement, more sibilance, more frustration. The supplement is the bit of the newspaper that most people throw away. It's the extra bit you get on Sunday, so you might get film, TV, travel, whatever it might be, and it's the extra bit, so it's not even in the main paper. So this war photographer has gone through all of this emotional torment and struggle for the sake of getting 5 or 6 pictures in Sunday supplement, which must be incredibly frustrating and create that conflict between, again, the photographer and the people who are in charge of the actual photos and the publications back at home. And again, there's a real frustration in this last section. This last section is all about how angry the photographer is with ordinary civilians here. So the reader's eyeballs prick with tears. They feel a bit sad, but they're not really crying. They're not really suffering. A prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. And the last phrase that Carol Ann Duffy uses here is "they do not care." So the last thing that the wall photographer refers to is that he's frustrated that people don't care. They're not more widely known. And he's incredibly angry by this, as is Carol Ann Duffy, presumably as she wrote the poem. So if you need to flick back or pause to get any of this down, please feel free. Right, last thing we're going to do then, as with most of the videos I've done, it's important to keep a really tight and simple kind of revision pack when you're looking at these poems. What you'll tend to find is in your anthology, maybe you'll have lots and lots of annotations in there, but actually they can be quite difficult to read some of the time. You have to, if you're actually revising for it, you think, oh, that's a lot of information in here. So it's really important, I think, to kind of minimize it, to reduce. So what I'm going to tell you to do now is just pick 3 quotations or features to memorize, the 3 that you understand the best. There's no right or wrong. They are all valid, but there'll be some that you get more than others, some that kind of ring true to you or you find easier to remember, and that's different from person to person. So it's important for you to make that choice. And just pick 3 quotations or features. You could either circle them in a different color in your anthology. You could put them on a revision card, maybe with a clue on the other side. Or possibly you could put them in like a small revision book, something like that. Make sure it's nice and neat and color coded so that you can remember it and it's easy for you to revise when the time comes. So have a go at that, and thank you for watching.